Picture this. It's the 8th century BCE. You live in a small city-state, your fields are green, your temple stands tall, your children play in the streets. Suddenly, you hear a sound in the distance. The ground begins to shake, dust rises on the horizon. The Assyrians are coming. The Assyrians weren't just another empire, they were a storm of iron and fire. Their armies swept across the ancient Near East with terrifying speed, crushing city after city. But for them, conquest was never enough. They didn't simply want to win wars. They wanted to control people's minds. They wanted obedience. They wanted fear. And to achieve that, they created a weapon the world had never seen before. A weapon that did not simply kill bodies, but broke spirits. It wasn't the sword, it wasn't the spear, it was deportation, mass exile. Entire populations uprooted from their homes, scattered to distant lands, their very identities erased. The Assyrians became the masters of deportation. They didn't just defeat nations, they made sure those nations could never rise again. The story of Assyria is not just the story of battles and kings. It is the story of fear itself. To live in the shadow of the Assyrian Empire was to live with the knowledge that at any moment, their armies might appear on the horizon, bringing with them a storm of fire, iron, and terror. The Assyrians rose from northern Mesopotamia, a land of rugged hills and rivers, where survival demanded discipline and strength. Over centuries, they forged themselves into the greatest war machine the ancient world had ever seen. Their armies were unlike anything their neighbors could imagine. Ironclad soldiers, disciplined formations, swift chariots, and siege engines that could break through the strongest walls. When the Assyrians marched, they came with overwhelming force, and resistance often ended in slaughter. But the Assyrians were more than warriors. They were masters of psychology. They understood that power was not only about killing enemies, it was about controlling the survivors. Fear, after all, lasts longer than a sword wound. So they built their empire not just on conquest, but on terror. Cities that resisted were burned to the ground. Leaders who defied them were flayed alive or impaled on stakes as warnings to others. Prisoners of war were paraded in chains, their humiliation carved forever into stone reliefs that still survive today. Every act of brutality sent a message: the Assyrians do not forgive. And yet, for all their cruelty, the Assyrians also possessed a cold brilliance. They realized that killing an enemy was only a temporary solution. A destroyed city could rebuild. A scattered army could rise again. What truly crushed resistance was the destruction of identity itself. If you uproot a people from their land, take them from their gods, their graves, their traditions, then you break the very core of who they are. This became the foundation of Assyrian power. Deportation was not an accident of war, it was a deliberate weapon. Whole communities were forced to march hundreds of miles away, never to return home. Farmers, craftsmen, priests, nobles, all torn from the soil that gave them meaning. The Assyrians called this strategy a policy of resettlement, but in truth, it was psychological warfare at its most devastating. Thus, the Assyrians stood not only as conquerors of land, but as conquerors of memory. They had found a way to win wars that never truly ended, because once a people was broken and scattered, there was no coming back. The world had seen many empires before, but none wielded fear with such precision. The Assyrians were not just an empire of soldiers, they were an empire of shadows. Before the rise of Assyria, war in the ancient Near East followed familiar patterns. Conquerors took plunder, captured a few slaves, maybe carried off a city's royal family or priesthood as trophies. Victories were brutal, but life had a way of continuing. A defeated city could rebuild, replant its fields, and recover its pride. Empires rose and fell, but people remained rooted to their land. The Assyrians broke this pattern. They realized that true power did not lie in defeating an army, but in dismantling the very foundations of a nation. It was not enough to burn crops or topple temples. If you truly wanted to erase resistance, you had to erase belonging. This was the logic behind deportation. Starting in the reign of kings like Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BCE, deportation became an official state policy. It wasn't random looting, it was carefully organized, carried out with military efficiency. After a conquest, Assyrian scribes would count the population, separate groups, and record them for resettlement. Soldiers would march entire communities, sometimes tens of thousands of people, across hundreds of miles. Families were torn apart, strangers mixed together, and new settlements were planted in distant corners of the empire. For the Assyrians, this served multiple purposes. Skilled workers, stonemasons, blacksmiths, scribes were resettled in the heart of Assyria to build palaces, temples, and irrigation canals. Farmers were placed on new lands to keep the empire's food supply strong. Conquered nobles were watched carefully, stripped of their local support, and forced to live under Assyrian supervision. And ordinary men, women, and children were scattered so widely that they could never reunite as a single people again. This system was so effective that it reshaped the map of the ancient world. Entire cultures began to fade, swallowed by the great Assyrian machine. The policy of deportation was recorded proudly in inscriptions, where kings boasted about moving whole nations like cattle. In their eyes, this was not cruelty, it was strategy, the mark of civilization and order imposed on chaos. Yet for those forced to march, it was nothing less than the end of their world. Imagine walking away from your homeland, knowing you would never again see your family graves, your ancestral fields, your sacred temples. Imagine being among strangers, forced to worship foreign gods, to speak foreign tongues. In one stroke, the Assyrians didn't just take land, they took identity. With this weapon, the Assyrians turned themselves into more than conquerors. They became engineers of empire, building their power not just on swords and walls, but on the shattered memories of the nations they destroyed. The Assyrian kings boasted that they could uproot entire nations with the stroke of a pen. To them, people were not communities, but resources, living pieces to be shifted across their empire like stones in a wall. They believed scattering the nations was the surest way to prevent rebellion, and the records describe this practice with chilling pride. One of the most famous examples came in 722 BCE, when the Assyrians crushed the kingdom of Israel. King Shalmaneser V, and after him, Sargon II, deported thousands of Israelites from their land. They were marched to Assyrian cities and provinces, scattered so widely that their identity as a single people began to dissolve. In their place, foreigners from Babylon, Cutha, and Hamath were resettled in the land of Israel. This deliberate mixing of populations planted the seeds of what history remembers as the lost tribes of Israel, a people whose traces faded into the vast Assyrian world. And Israel was not alone. Babylonian chronicles, Egyptian inscriptions, and later biblical texts all speak of Assyrian deportations. From the mountains of Urartu to the plains of Elam, from Damascus to the shores of the Mediterranean, countless communities were uprooted. Farmers who had cultivated the same soil for generations found themselves forced to till foreign fields. Craftsmen who built temples in their hometowns now built palaces for the Assyrian kings. Priests were torn from their gods' sanctuaries and made to serve in unfamiliar shrines. Assyrian inscriptions carved in stone show long lines of exiles trudging behind soldiers, carrying children and bundles of belongings. The kings gloried in these images, proof that they had not only conquered bodies, but had broken souls. The empire became a mosaic of displaced peoples, each one cut off from their roots and forced to survive in new lands under Assyrian watch. This was more than control, it was transformation. By scattering nations, the Assyrians reshaped identities. Over time, languages mixed, traditions merged, and old loyalties vanished. What was once a proud, independent community became just another subject of the empire, indistinguishable from the rest. In scattering the nations, the Assyrians invented a new kind of conquest. They destroyed not just cities, but continuity. They shattered the link between land, memory, and people. And once that bond was broken, the past could not be rebuilt. To the outside world, Assyrian deportations seemed like acts of cruelty. But to the Assyrians, they were acts of genius, carefully calculated moves in the game of empire. Behind the terror, there was a cold logic. The first reason was security. The Assyrians ruled over a patchwork of nations: Israelites, Arameans, Babylonians, Phoenicians, Medes. Each people had its own gods, its own traditions, its own pride. If left untouched, they could unite, rebel, and threaten the empire's stability. But if you uprooted them, scattered them into small, powerless groups, they could never rise again. A people without a homeland was a people without a future. Deportation was, in essence, rebellion-proofing the empire. The first reason was security. The Assyrians ruled over a patchwork of nations: Israelites, Arameans, Babylonians, Phoenicians, Medes. Each people had its own gods, its own traditions, its own pride. If left untouched, they could unite, rebel, and threaten the empire's stability. But if you uprooted them, scattered them into small, powerless groups, they could never rise again. A people without a homeland was a people without a future. Deportation was, in essence, rebellion-proofing the empire. The second reason was economic strength. The Assyrian Empire was vast, but not all regions were equally productive. Some lands lacked farmers. Some cities needed skilled craftsmen. Some provinces needed loyal populations to counterbalance restless natives. Deportation allowed the Assyrians to redistribute human talent wherever it was most useful. When the Israelites were deported, many were forced into labor projects, building canals, roads, and fortresses that strengthened Assyria's infrastructure. In this way, conquest fueled growth, not just destruction. The third reason was propaganda and humiliation. Deportation sent a message not only to the conquered, but to every nation watching from afar. It declared, "Defy us, and you will lose not just your battle, you will lose your very identity." For kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Sennacherib, deportation was a badge of honor. They carved their victories in stone, boasting of the tens of thousands they had uprooted. Each inscription was both a record and a warning. The final reason was control of memory. A defeated nation might try to preserve its culture through stories, rituals, and temples, but strip them from their land, remove them from their sacred spaces, and over time, those stories fade. Religion, culture, and identity were tied to place, and once the place was gone, identity dissolved. This was the deepest cut of all. In the eyes of the Assyrians, deportation was not cruelty, it was policy. It was the science of empire building. And it worked so effectively that later empires, the Babylonians, the Persians, even the Romans, would borrow the idea. But it was the Assyrians who wielded it with the greatest ruthlessness. They were not simply warriors of the sword. They were strategists of the mind, ruling as much through fear and displacement as through armies and chariots.